Some stories exist to enlighten the mind, some to temporarily inspire hope or passion. But there is one set of writings meant to chill you to the bone, or make you question what is actually possible. These stories are called Creepypasta. An old woman has been stalking me for years. Written by You Shall Not Pass, 121. I used to love long drives, especially growing up. You watch the world go by and make up stories about people you see. It's the perfect time to escape into a fantasy inside your head, because sooner or later, the journey will end and you'll be back to the mundane realities of life. My family and I used to take long drives, mainly to visit my grandparents who lived about 150 miles away in a quaint little rural town. It was the best aspect of my childhood, but one particular journey, I saw something that's been stalking me ever since. It was that day that subsequently changed my life forever, and not for the better. Nothing was particularly strange or untoward about that day. We were getting ready for another drive over to my grandparents for the weekend. It was Friday evening. We almost always made the drive on a Friday evening because my parents worked late and I was already waiting in my designated seat in the back, waiting for my mom and dad to finish loading the car. Eventually we set off, and once we left the concrete jungle behind and hit the trees and long roads, my mind once again began to drift to my fantasy world. I like to tell stories to myself in my head, especially about the people that I encountered along the long journey. I imagine the conversations these people would have, what their lives were like, what jobs they had, whether they were happy or not, what troubles ailed them throughout their lives. It was really a fun way to pass the time. On occasion, I would see lone individuals scattered across the dense woods that we so often passed, and at times I'd imagine them being on a quest or an adventure through the woods, trying to locate an ancient ruin or treasure. This time was different though. My eyes were scanning the woods for any movement, nothing unusual, just searching for anything that would satiate my imagination when I saw an old woman, dressed all in white. Her hair was a wild mess of just black hair, and I think I was looking at the back of her. I couldn't be sure, but as we got closer, I realized she was facing forward. At a glance, I could see that she wasn't moving. She stood motionless at the edge of the woods, looking out blankly onto the road ahead, the road that I was on. As we drove past, I finally saw her face. It was quite dark at this point, but I could still make out the intricate details of her face and, most importantly of all, her expression. It was blank, just as I suspected. However, her eyes moved with the motion of our car. Her eyes followed us. As we drove past, she saw my face. We locked eyes and she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant sort of smile, though. It wasn't a smile that you'd get when you see your grandmother, one that made you feel all warm inside. Her smile was ugly. Her mouth was gaping, and it was so wide it looked wild, accompanied by an equally horrific stare. I turned away. My skin was crawling, and I shuddered so suddenly that my mother felt it in the front seat. She asked me if I was okay, and I lied and said that I was. I turned around, and I guess despite my elevated fear, my curiosity always got the better of me. I saw her white dress flapping wildly in the wind, and as soon as I turned to look at her, she turned to face the direction we were driving and just started running. Running so fast that I gasped and quickly laid down on the seat. I didn't look again, but it's safe to say that she didn't catch up with us. Not yet. It was 4 weeks later that I saw her again. On the same trip and on the same road. We were on our way to visit my grandparents again, and to be honest, I had written the first encounter off as a really surreal, very scary experience, but an isolated one. I didn't think it was going to happen again, and I certainly didn't think that as time went on, I would see her more frequently and basically not just on that one road, but everywhere. Wherever I went, she was there. As I mentioned, we were on our way to see my grandparents again, and I'd long forgotten the strange woman and her gaping smile. I was daydreaming out the window when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something white. It was momentary, just a flash of white cloth, and then I saw her. I caught her eye straight away. The last thing I wanted to see was that smile again, but there it was, and it was somehow so much worse this time. I saw a wide, gaping mouth that turned into a long smile, an unnaturally long smile. Her skin seemed to stretch, and it was so taut that it looked like her face was just going to split in two. I sat there, immobilized, and honestly, I felt like time slowed down. What I saw next made me scream. Her tongue slid out of her mouth like a silent serpent, protruding awkwardly. Her mouth was full of teeth, but they were decayed, broken. She then proceeded to lick her lips with her lengthy serpentine tongue and pointed her freakishly long and bony finger at me. She was pointing her finger at me. I screamed. Both my parents jumped out of their seats and asked me what happened. I told them I was fine and I was just having a nightmare. How wrong I was. My grandparents passed away a few weeks later. As a family, we were heartbroken. Everything slowed down for a while. And I didn't go to school. My parents didn't go to work, especially my mom. Things were difficult for a while, but I never truly forgot about that woman in the woods. Then one day, my mom told us we had to make a drive over to my grandparents' house to pick up a few things that were left behind. My blood chilled. But maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't see her again. It had been a long time since we made the drive, so I didn't think she'd be there. She couldn't be. Friday came around quite quickly, quicker than I would have liked, and we were on our way, but for the last time. The woods that I'd looked at countless times were there in front of me once more. I scanned the familiar trees for any sight of her, but she wasn't there. The relief I felt was quite unexplainable, although I refrained from looking out the window for the rest of the journey, there and back. Eventually, I went back to school. I was on the bus there when I saw her again. On my way into school, the bus journeyed between a small park and a few shops. She stood, her face devoid of any expression, at the entrance of the park. People walked past her idly. It was as if they couldn't see her. The bus stopped at a traffic light, and that's when she saw me. I was overwhelmed by feelings of shock and pure disbelief. Was this really happening? She saw me. There was no smile this time, but she opened her mouth so wide and it began to move. It was as if she was speaking, forming words, but of course I couldn't hear them. Her mouth moved unnaturally. The movements were slow, but also swift, like she was shouting, but also like her words were coming out as a whisper. When I tell you I've never been that scared in my life, I mean it. I couldn't make heads or tails of what was happening. Had she followed me? And if so, most importantly, what did she want from me? I saw her every day on my way to school. Every day she was there. Eventually I stopped taking the bus and my mom had to take me to school. And even then, nothing changed and she was still there every time we drove past. I'd even asked my mom to go a different way. Wherever we went, she was there. And as unbelievable as this is going to sound, it seemed like every day she was getting a little bit closer. Life went on like that for a while. She was always there, but somehow she wasn't. And I'd begin to finally have hope that she wouldn't return the next day, but she did. And I knew I was just clutching at straws. She always returned. Some of you might say that I should have told someone. That I should have at least told my parents, but I just couldn't. I knew no one would believe me because I knew that no one else could see her. She was stalking me and only me. Some of you may say that I should have confronted her, but I was young, terrified and confused, and anyway, I didn't want to close the distance between us. She was getting closer every day. Every day I was able to see her more clearly. The closer she got, the scarier she looked. I was right about one thing. Her mouth was full of teeth, and they really were decayed and broken. She was tall, taller than she looked from afar. At least 6 foot, and the gown she was wearing wasn't as wide as I'd first believed. It was sporadically stained. Her feet were bare and her skin blackened. Her limbs were long, especially her arms and hands and fingers, and her hair was a wild mess of black and thin strips adorned in slime. It's safe to say that she was a terrifying sight, and I often dreamt about her. One day I was getting ready to go to school and mentally preparing for her. My mom couldn't drive me, so I had to take the bus. I stepped out my front door, and right in front lay a small white piece of paper. I hesitated, but I slowly went over and picked it up and read the contents. In 5 years. That's all it said. I dropped the note, and as I looked up, that's when I saw her. She stood on the outskirts of the bushes that were in front of the road opposite of our house. She lifted her elongated, abnormally thickened veined hand and pointed her finger at me. Her mouth was moving, but all I could make out were faint mutterings. I watched her mouth move, and when I realized what she was saying, my heart was beating so fast that I thought it was going to stop. The words she mouthed instilled such an absolute fear within me that I think my heart did stop for a moment. She mouthed the words, "In 5 years." I remember screaming and running for my life. I never forgot about that note, and she never let me forget. The older I got, the more frequent her visits became. I would see her on buses and in cars, on trains, and even on the fucking airplane. I kept thinking about what was going to happen in 5 years. I finished school with poor grades. I started smoking, drinking, and generally being a very substandard young adult. I couldn't even keep a job. My relationship with my parents deteriorated severely, and I don't speak to them anymore. She was there, always when I stepped out of my house and when I turned a corner. Each time I was near a window, she was there. She was ruining my life. I'm 20 now, and I write this from the confines of my small one-bedroom flat. I wanted to share my story with anyone that would listen and just to have some fraction of me left in this world. I find that stories live online, and there will always be some slither of me found in the deep crevice of the web. I don't think I've got long left. As I told you above, the woman has been getting closer to me for years. Each day I would find her a step closer. I'll bet a small step, but still a step. In recent weeks and months, I've seen her getting closer and closer to my window. I live on the ground floor. Tonight she's already here. I was sitting at my computer, gearing up to write this story when I heard a shuffling outside my window. I got up to have a look and opened my curtains a fraction to get a peek. I always keep my curtains closed, and what I saw terrified me to my very core. It was her. Only this time, she was crouching. She crouched so low that at first I couldn't see her at all. It was my dim bedroom light that alerted me to her presence. It illuminated her eyes in the darkness. She smiled wildly. It was so dark that all I could see were her mad, dark eyes and her decrepit, fragmented teeth. I screamed and ran to my bathroom and locked myself in. I've been here for about an hour now, and I've been writing this from my phone. I heard a window break earlier, so I know she's in my flat. She's inside and even closer to me now. I can hear her shuffling about the flat, looking for me, dragging her elongated arms across my floor. She's at my bathroom door now. She's knocking. The knocks are louder and louder each time. I'm crying now and my phone is going to die. She's banging at the door with her arms, banging and banging. The noise is deafening. She bangs so hard the lock breaks and thuds on the floor. My phone is nearly dead. The door is opening. It stands ajar for a brief moment before I see a long, pale hand grab from the outside and push it open. She peeks her head around, smiles at me, and pushes the door open. She's walking towards me and her arms reach out. I hope you enjoyed that story. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button and follow me on Twitter. If you don't hit the subscribe button and follow me on Twitter, this woman will come for you, unfortunately. So make sure you do that.